In my vision, I saw a lamb break one of 7 seals, and I heard one of 4 living creatures shout in a voice like thunder, "Come!" Immediately, I saw a white horse appear. Its rider was holding a bow. He was given a victor's crown, and he went away to claim many victories. When he broke the 2nd seal, out came another horse, bright red. Its rider was given this duty: take away peace, and set people killing each other. When he broke the 3rd seal, I saw a black horse appear. Its rider was holding a pair of scales, measuring out a day's wages for a quart of corn and a quart of barley. When he broke the 4th seal, I saw another horse appear, deathly pale, and its pale rider was called Death, and Hades followed at its heels. They were given authority over earth, to kill by the sword, by famine, by plague, and through wild beasts.
This is the end, beautiful friend.
Greetings, kittens. Welcome to the podcast of Doom, the podcast devoted to epic failure analysis. I'm your host, David Appleson. Today we will discuss the Spanish flu, perhaps the deadliest pandemic to hit humanity. The passage we heard at the beginning of the podcast was selections from Revelations 6:4 through 6:8 of the Holy Roman Bible. That was a description of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse: war, famine, plague, and the animals turning against us. I suppose that last one is open to interpretation, but I'm taking it in its literal sense. Revelations limited the horsemen of Armageddon to just 4, so I think it's important that one of those horsemen represented the plague. 2 of the books used to research this podcast reference the 4th horseman, the pale rider on a pale horse. I thought it wouldn't be a bad idea to revisit that passage before starting on one of the greatest afflictions to hit mankind. The origins of the Spanish flu are still not known almost 100 years since the event passed, but epidemiologists are pretty confident it didn't start in Spain. This flu, or influenza, came in 3 waves. The first wave appeared just like ordinary flu, the kind you or someone you know experiences every flu season, which, as it happens, we're right in the middle of one now. There was fever, headaches, and chills, but after a few days of discomfort it would pass. But in the second wave, which arrived just a few months later, everything changed. The flu virus turns much more aggressive, much more infectious, far more contagious, and it attacked quickly, taking down healthy young men and women in as little as 72 hours. The Spanish flu would go on to infect 500 million people, or about 1/3 of the global population at that time, and kill 50 to 100 million people from every part of the world. By the time the 3rd wave came, there was hardly anyone left to infect. The Spanish flu was one of the most devastating events of the 20th century, killing more people than World War I, and by some accounts more people than World War II. And yet we hardly read or hear about it, because unlike the 2 world wars, very few people wanted to talk about the flu pandemic after it was over. Before we get started with our story, though, I would like to introduce you to my little buddy. He's a very little buddy, and he's your buddy too. The virus just might be the smallest life form that we know, if it is actually a life form at all. Viruses are so small, in fact, that they cannot be seen with an ordinary optical microscope, the kind you would find in most laboratories. Viruses are about 1/100th the size of the average bacteria. Although bacteria are visible under an optical microscope, in order to see a virus you need what's called an electron microscope, which are very rare and very expensive. An electron microscope can magnify an object up to 10 million times. The first virus wasn't actually seen until 1931, when the electron microscope was invented, or 12 years after the Spanish flu receded, meaning that no one could see what was killing them. Viruses are living organisms that cannot replicate without a host cell. Because of that fact, there's much debate about whether they qualify as life forms at all. Assuming they do, they are the most abundant biological entity on Earth. Before entering a cell, viruses exist in a form known as virins. These virins have genetic material in the form of DNA and RNA. Because they have genes and chromosomes, they go through a process of natural selection. They can transfer mutations from one virus to another, but they lack key characteristics like basic cell structure and can only reproduce in organisms that actually contain cells. Viruses are found wherever there is life and have probably existed since living cells first evolved. Viruses do not contain a ribosome, which is necessary to create proteins and continue the life cycle. This makes them totally dependent on their host. They are the only type of microorganism that cannot produce without a host cell. After contacting a host cell, a virus will insert genetic material into the host and take over that host's functions. After infecting the cell, the virus continues to reproduce, but it uses the cell to produce more viral protein and genetic material instead of the usual cellular products. It is this process that earns viruses the classification of parasite. The viral protein will bind with available genetic material in the host cell, producing more viruses. These new viruses will burst out from the host cell, killing it in the process and releasing anywhere from 100,000 to 1 million new viruses, ready to attack just as many healthy host cells. When you are infected by a virus, such as influenza, the parasite virus starts a process that converts your healthy, life-supporting cells into unhealthy host cells, producing billions and billions of more viruses. As the virus replicates in the body, it starts to affect the host. During this early incubation period, symptoms may start to show. As healthy cells are replaced by unhealthy and destructive virus-infected cells, vital organs and life-supporting functions begin to deteriorate, leading to illness and sometimes death. When an infected person coughs or sneezes, more than 500,000 virus particles can be spread into the air and onto nearby surfaces, where the viruses can come into contact with new, uninfected human hosts. When a virus spreads, it can pick up some of its host's DNA and take it to another cell or organism. If the virus enters the host's DNA, it can affect the wider genome by moving around a chromosome or to a new chromosome. This can have long-term effects on a person. In humans, it may explain the development of diseases such as hemophilia and muscular dystrophy. This interaction with host DNA can also cause viruses to change or mutate. Some viruses only affect one type of organism, say birds. If a virus that normally affects birds does by chance enter a human, and if it picks up some human DNA, this can produce a new type of virus that human immune systems don't recognize and cannot defend. That is why scientists are concerned about rare viruses that spread from animals to people. Viruses spread in many ways. Viruses in plants are often transmitted from plant to plant by insects that feed on plant sap, such as aphids. Viruses in animals can be carried by blood-sucking insects, such as fleas or mosquitoes. These disease-transmitting organisms are known as vectors. Viruses may transmit from person to person and from mother to child during pregnancy or delivery. They can also spread through touch, exchanges of saliva, coughing or sneezing, sexual contact, contaminated food or water, or insects that carry them from one person to another, usually through human blood. Some viruses can live on an object for a long time, so if a person touches an item with the virus on their hands, say a letter, a doorknob, or an article of clothing, the next person who comes along can pick up that virus by touching the same object. Such objects are known as fomite. The word influenza comes from the Italian language meaning influence and refers to the cause of the disease. Initially, this ascribed illness to unfavorable astrological influences. Changes in medical thought led to its modification to the term influenza del freddo, meaning influence of the cold, as the flu was known for striking mostly in the fall or winter. The word influenza was first used in English by J. Hugger of the University of Edinburgh in 1703, so descriptions of the flu go back more than 300 years. The French used to call it la grippe, if you've ever wondered what that term meant. I know I did. We know that epidemics or pestilence have been around for thousands of years because the Bible tells us so. The first recorded outbreak of flu was by Hippocrates, namesake of the Hippocratic Oath. In 412 BC, he discovered that the townsfolk of Perinthus in northern Greece were all getting sick and showing similar symptoms: sore throat, aches, difficulty swallowing, paralysis of the legs, and an inability to see at night. He called it the cough of Perinthus. But we recognize most of these symptoms today as influenza, or the flu for short. Hippocrates used the word epidemic, or of the people, and he referred to it specifically as a disease. Hippocrates blamed the disease on an imbalance of the four humors, or the fluids and substances that come out of the human body. We now know that he was examining symptoms rather than causes. His contemporary, Thucydides, described a similar plague that affected Athens while they were at war with Sparta. Thucydides was able to identify that each plague victim was infecting many others. He also attributed the Athenians' loss to the Spartans in the Peloponnesian War as partly due to the deaths caused by this plague. Medical research actually regressed following the collapse of the Roman and Greek empires. Hippocrates' theory of four humors was replaced by the theory of miasma. Miasma was considered to be a poisonous vapor or mist filled with particles from decomposed matter, miasmata, that caused illnesses. The foul air was caused by poor hygienic conditions, which actually can cause some diseases. As we talked about in episode 14 on the Bubonic Plague, the prevailing thought was that it was these bad vapors that were spreading the plague. That led to the advent of the plague doctor, who dressed in a head-to-toe gown and wore a mask, often with a large bird-like beak, through which he sniffed pleasant aromas to ward off the bad vapors. That did nothing to prevent the microscopic organisms from entering their systems, and plague doctors dropped at the same rate as their patients, which is to say like flies. As we learned in episode 6, the Great London Smog, cholera was absolutely making a killing in Dickensian London and other British cities. That was until Dr. John Snow started to map out the locations of the residents who were dying of cholera, and couldn't help but notice that the deaths were grouped around certain public water wells. Snow concluded that it wasn't bad vapors that were killing people, it was the sewage-tinged drinking water. Go figure. In 1892, Dmitry Ivanovsky discovered that a disease killing tobacco plants was caused by an extremely minuscule infectious agent capable of permeating porcelain Chamberlain filters, something which bacteria could not do. He concluded that the damage was being done by a malevolent life form that was smaller than bacteria. That led to the work of German scientist Robert Koch, who was able to isolate and examine under a microscope the bacteria that causes cholera. Not just cholera, he determined, but anthrax, typhoid, and tuberculosis were all caused by bacteria. The miasma theory was finally disproved, giving way to germ theory, as postulated by French medical doctor and research scientist Louis Pasteur. He held that contagious diseases were not caused by vapors, but by tiny microorganisms such as bacteria and viruses that are too small to be seen by the human eye. It was the spread of these harmful microorganisms that caused epidemics. Also in 1892, Richard Pfeiffer, a student of Robert Koch, isolated the infective agent causing influenza. He called it Bacillus influenzae, or Haemophilus influenzae, but it was better known as Pfeiffer's bacillus. It wasn't until the 1940s, with the invention of the electron microscope, that scientists identified influenza as a virus, not a bacillus. Using the electron microscope, scientists could see that the surface of a virus was covered with spikes and mushroom-like spines. The spikes are called hemagglutinin, and their purpose is to find and stick to healthy red blood cells, in the same way that Velcro works. The mushroom-shaped spines are called neuraminidase, and they act like glass cutters that allow the virus to detach from the red blood cell. It is the combination of hemagglutinin and neuraminidase that form the scientific names for each mutation of flu virus. The Spanish flu is known as H1N1. Hong Kong flu is H2N2. Avian flu is H9N2. When outside viruses swap genetic material with viruses from a host organism, it is known as antigenic shift. For example, when a bird virus swaps genetic material with a human virus, the result is a new virus with the same destructive habits as the old virus, but it is unrecognized by human immune systems. That is the reason why new versions of the flu appear every flu season, and why vaccines need to be updated every flu season. In 1889, the world was hit with the first flu epidemic in which the scientific community understood that the root cause was microorganisms moving from one human to another. The Russian flu, or as the Russians may have called it, the Asiatic flu, appears to have originated in Bukhara, Uzbekistan. With a better understanding of germ theory as a source of transmission, scientists took notice and even the press began reporting on it. Press reports not only referred to the local spread of the disease, but also mentioned the situation in numerous, often distant European cities such as Paris, London, Vienna, and Berlin. Apart from data about where and when the illness occurred, the reports provided descriptions of symptoms, treatment methods, data on morbidity and mortality, information on the activities of public authorities, and the impact of the epidemic on daily life. The virus moved about the globe with amazing speed, striking Siberia, northern Canada, and Greenland in one direction, while also moving through Moscow, St. Petersburg, and into Europe from the other direction in a little under 6 months. Like the Spanish flu, the Russian flu came in 3 waves between 1889 and 1892. Changes that took place in the 19th century fostered the rapid spread of the disease. Substantial increases in the population, especially in towns, facilitated the expansion of infectious diseases transmitted from person to person. The intensive development of railways also contributed to this effect because they linked distant places with numerous intermediate stops and enabled large numbers of people to travel within a short time across vast distances. Newspaper articles contained detailed information about symptoms and causes of death. What did arouse the interest of the reader was news on the illnesses and deaths of well-known and important people like kings or ministers. Furthermore, the newspapers described the consequences of the epidemic, such as overcrowded hospitals, lack of doctors, and losses in trade. Norwegian painter Edvard Munch even claimed that it was thoughts of the Russian flu that inspired him to paint his masterpiece, The Scream. Targeting Europe especially, the Russian flu claimed upwards of 1 million lives and was a precursor to the much more lethal Spanish flu. For the first time, people around the world could truly grasp and experience the meaning of a pandemic, that is, an epidemic that reaches across continents, and they could compare effects and responses in faraway places with those of their own country. For those people about to get slammed by the Spanish flu, the years just before the Great War must have seemed like one rush of events and inventions after another. In just a few years, that generation had seen the rise of passenger locomotive trains, which greatly reduced time and distance for travelers, the first airplanes, the first automobiles, the electrification of cities and towns, which included the lighting of streets and houses, the telephone, the telegraph, advances in photography, the steamship, and the first refrigerators designed for the home. Those were heady times for mechanical technology and for medical research as well. Discoveries about the cause and treatment of disease were taking place on a rapidly increasing basis. Vaccines were discovered for smallpox, anthrax, rabies, tetanus, and diphtheria. Thanks to the work of John Snow and others, sanitation was improving. Better microscopes were being developed that gave researchers a better view of life at the microorganic level, which led to improvements in the study of human tissue samples. And we should keep in mind that many of the discoveries that led to the acceptance of germ theory over miasma theory occurred during or just after the 3 waves of Russian flu. Yet even with all these advances and the medical field being held in the highest of esteem by the general populace, infectious disease was still the biggest killer of people. And not by a small margin. It took far more lives than heart attacks, cancer, war, murder, or dying in an accident involving one of those dandy new machines, the car, the plane, or the steamship. The world was still painfully unaware of how viruses sickened and killed us, not to mention how to properly treat someone with a viral infection. In March of 1918, soldiers at Fort Riley, Kansas, were given the less than admirable task of burning several tons of horse manure. Horses at that time still served an important function during times of war. As this burn was going on, which I imagine must have smelled something fierce, a gale wind kicked up and blew a choking dust across the Kansas prairie. That combination produced a stinking yellow haze and a sky that was almost black. The storm continued for 3 hours. When it stopped, everything in the entire area was covered with a thick coating of dust. The soldiers were then tasked with cleaning up this dusty mess, and they worked long into the morning hours, sweeping, raking, shoveling, and coughing. 11 months prior to that dust storm, the United States had entered into the Great War, what we know today as World War I, on the side of the Allies. The Russians had recently signed a treaty with the Germans and withdrawn from the war. That allowed hundreds of thousands of German troops, previously stationed on the Russian front, to transfer to the Western Front. Now holding the numerical superiority, the Germans and their Central Power allies claimed a number of victories, and the war effort was looking grim for the Allies. Mobilization takes time, and American Commander General John Pershing had promised his Allied counterparts 1.4 million troops. That led to hundreds of thousands of new recruits, or doughboys, flooding into boot camps across the United States, just like the one in Fort Riley. For the first time in their lives, many of these young men were away from their mostly rural homes and crammed into army barracks like sardines. In fact, Camp Funston, located within Fort Riley, housed 56,000 soldiers just on its own. 2 days later, on March 4, 1918, Private Albert Gitchell, a camp cook, reported into the infirmary shortly before dawn with a sore throat, fever, and headache. As a cook, Gitchell was up before the rest of the soldiers, ready to prepare their breakfast, and because of that fact, Albert Gitchell would be forever known as the first reported case of the Spanish Influenza. Gitchell was running a fever of 104 Fahrenheit or 40 Celsius. He was burning up from the inside. The medical officer immediately ordered Gitchell to an isolation bed as a precaution. The next man in line reported the exact same symptoms as Gitchell, except that he was running a temperature of 106 Fahrenheit or 41 centigrade, a nearly critical reading. That soldier was also ordered to the isolation ward. But things didn't stop there. By noon that day, they had 107 similar cases on their hands, and by week's end the number was up to 522. By the end of the month, the number was over 1,000. Camp Funston had a big problem. Gitchell was the first reported case of Spanish flu, but 2 months prior and 300 miles away in Haskell County, Kansas, Dr. Loring Miner noticed several of his patients had developed similar flu symptoms of a kind he hadn't seen before. The flu progressed within a matter of hours, and within 3 to 5 days of the first symptoms, Dr. Miner had logged several dozen deaths. He reported his findings to public health officials who squelched the report until late March, when the Haskell outbreak appeared to have stopped. But by that time, numerous recruits had passed through Haskell on their way to Camp Funston. On that first day of outbreak at Camp Funston, the medic treating the flu victims called his boss, who called Fort Riley's chief medical officer, Colonel Edward Schreiner, with the news. Schreiner had been fearing an outbreak of flu given the camp's overcrowded and cold, drafty barracks. In addition to the typical flu symptoms, some patients at Camp Funston were so ill they could not stand up, and the disease earned the nickname knock-me-down fever. Within 5 days of Gitchel's diagnosis, 48 soldiers had died from this flu variant. Young men had gone from robust health to death in a matter of days, in some cases hours. Schreiner was alarmed and horrified by the advanced symptoms of this flu, which included violent coughing, projectile nosebleeds, think explosive red sneezes, and blue discoloration of the face. Schreiner took several tissue cultures from the victims and immediately identified the culprit as Pfeiffer's bacillus, a prognosis that was close but not correct. We now know it was a virus, and as mentioned, there was no technology available that could see something as small as a virus. Schreiner telegraphed Washington, D.C. Many deaths. Influenza following. Immediately 2 extremely severe dust storms. All that scientific knowledge, and the chief medical officer was still looking for a miasma explanation. By April, the flu had run its course at Fort Riley. There were no more cases of flu being reported. But the influenza virus hadn't stopped at the boundaries of Fort Riley. Within weeks, outbreaks were reported at U.S. Army camps in Georgia and South Carolina, more than 1,000 miles away from Kansas. In April, a dozen more camps in California, Florida, Virginia, and Alabama reported outbreaks, including Fort Dix in New Jersey, a major hub for shipping out to the battlefields of Europe. The overcrowded camps that placed soldiers from all over the country, side by side, was the perfect breeding ground for the influenza virus. In March, more than 1,000 workers at Ford Motor Company's Detroit, Michigan plant reported sick, as well as 500 inmates at San Quentin Prison in California. But there was no civilian agency that monitored public health at the federal level at that time, so most reports remained at the local level, and the nation relied on Army reports to track the progress of the disease beyond cities and counties. Mortality statistics from New York City to Minneapolis to San Francisco to Seattle to Birmingham, Alabama, were showing a spike in deaths of people aged 21 to 29. Yet the Journal of the American Medical Association for March and April made no mention of a flu outbreak. In the middle of April, there was an outbreak at Brest, France, on the Atlantic coast, one of the chief debarkation ports for American troops. From there, the flu virus followed the path of the soldiers of the American Expeditionary Force to camps in Marne and Vosges. On April 15th, the medical officer at the French military hospital in Bordeaux reported flu cases of epidemic proportions of an unknown nature. The symptoms were similar to Camp Funston: severe headache, backache, chills, followed by high fever and inflammation of the upper respiratory system. Outbreaks of influenza or fever were reported in Etaples, France, across from Hastings on the English Channel. In fact, reports of a flu outbreak in Etaples went back to 1916, preceding the outbreak at Fort Riley. Etaples, overflowing at that time with soldiers and supplies in transit, would have been a perfect source for the spreading flu. By May 1918, thousands of French soldiers were infected, and American troops began referring to the sickness as la grippe. Suddenly, all across Europe, soldiers and civilians were coming down with this savage version of the flu. Lieutenant Giuseppe Agostoni, a medic in Cittadella, Italy, watched in horror as the flu ravaged his regiment. He noted that men were choking to death, gagging on the bloody regurgitation of their fluid-filled lungs. Their faces were turning gray, then purple, and finally brown. Labored breathing produced a strange duck-like quack. When Agostoni attempted to draw blood from an ill patient, the hypodermic needle got stuck. The coagulated blood was black and gummy and as viscous as tar. The Germans called it Flanders fever, or the Blitzkatar, an attack on the lungs. Both sides of the trenches were being attacked by the influenza virus at the same time. In February, the influenza virus hit San Sebastian, a seaside resort town in the north of Spain, just a few miles south of the border with France. Town officials, who were worried about a drop-off in tourism, tried to contain news of the outbreak. Almeria, a prison on the other side of Spain, also experienced an outbreak at the same time. By now it should be clear that enclosed, crowded conditions like prisons and army camps are a perfect breeding ground for the flu virus. By March, influenza had broken out all across neutral Spain. Again, officials tried to suppress reports of the illness, but those efforts proved moot when the Spanish paper El Sol published a front-page story that their head of state, King Alfonso, had contracted the flu. Unlike the combatant nations of Europe and the United States, Spain had no wartime censorship of the press. Soon news of the flu outbreak in Spain was making headlines in newspapers all across the world. And that is how this case of H1N1 came to be known as the Spanish flu, or affectionately as the Spanish lady. It should be noted that the Spanish often referred to this bout of influenza as the Soldier of Naples, after a catchy little tune from a popular mini-opera at the time. Get it? You catch the flu? The song was a catchy little number? Okay, Spanish flu it is. As many as 8 million people in Spain were infected, and more than 700 people died just in Madrid. By May, it had spread to Greece, Macedonia, and Egypt. From there, it spread to Iran and India, where it was reported at such railway hubs as Bombay, Calcutta, Madras, and Rangoon. As the influenza virus surged across Europe, Asia, the Americas, and Africa, it underwent another mutation. June and July of 1918 saw record fatalities across England, Scotland, and Wales, while Germany erupted into a full-blown epidemic in June. Denmark and Norway followed in July. Holland and Sweden were hit in August. And as if to show all the combatants of the Great War who was alpha dog, Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, King George V, and Prime Minister Lloyd George of England, and General John Pershing of the United States, all were felled by the Spanish flu virus in 1918, although all managed to survive. By September, outbreaks were reported in Shanghai, Japan, Peru, New Zealand, and Australia. The flu was attacking coal miners in Sierra Leone, Africa, as well as dock workers in Archangel in the northern extremes of Russia. The fact that the flu was spreading so widely and so quickly had something to do with those new technological marvels of the new century: locomotives, steamships, trucks, and automobiles. People were traveling further and faster than ever, and so were the microbes. Oddly, while the flu was spreading rapidly around the world during the summer of 1918, it was hitting mostly the civilian population. Signs of influenza were actually decreasing among those in the military during this time. American soldiers were statistically healthier than ever during the early summer. Although none of this changed the American Army's habit of cramming thousands of recruits into tight barracks facilities before jamming them into poorly ventilated battleships and transport vessels. In June, 279,000 American soldiers sailed for Europe. In July, the number was 300,000, and in August it was 286,000. In 6 months, the U.S. would move 1.5 million troops to the continent. On August 12, 1918, the H1N1 virus had worked its way back to America when the thoroughly infected Norwegian vessel, the Bergensfjord, arrived in New York City harbor. Immediately, 11 of its passengers were taken to a hospital in Brooklyn with flu-like symptoms. None of them were isolated. Royal Copeland, the city's health commissioner, kept the lid on reports of the flu, not wanting to cause a panic. Public reporting of flu cases was not allowed until September 17th, by which time there were so many cases, the reports did little to stop the spread. It wasn't until October 4th that Copeland officially admitted that the city had an epidemic on its hands. On August 27th, the Navy's Commonwealth Pier in Boston, which housed up to 7,000 sailors at any one time and was a major transit point for Navy personnel shipping out, reported 2 cases of influenza. The next day it was 8 cases, and the day after that it was 58 cases. On September 13th, the Boston Globe declared that doctors had the Spanish flu pretty well in hand. That afternoon, the Navy announced 163 new cases just at their facility. "No reason to be alarmed," a Rear Admiral declared. The two busiest ports in the U.S. for shipping out military personnel to Europe were now reinfected with the flu. Camp Devens was an Army base just west of Boston. It was built to house 36,000 soldiers, but in the rush to get soldiers to the front, it now had more than 45,000 troops. It had its first reported cases in late August, and by the end of that month there were 30 cases. In 2 weeks' time they had 12,600 cases. The camp hospital was built to accommodate 2,000 patients. They now had more than 8,000. Some of the victims collapsed outside in the rain, waiting to be admitted. Ashen-faced soldiers struggled in agony on beds with blood-stained sheets, delirious and dying. As nurses ran out of beds, cots were laid among the 3 miles of corridors to accommodate the overflow from the infirmaries. Dr. Roy Grist, an Army doctor at Camp Devens, kept a written record of the accounts. He wrote, "The flu has developed so rapidly that the camp is demoralized, and all ordinary work is held up until it has passed. All assemblages of soldiers are taboo. The disease starts out looking like an ordinary influenza, but when soldiers are brought to the hospital, they rapidly develop the most vicious type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. 2 hours after admission, they have mahogany spots over the cheekbones, and a few hours later you can begin to see the cyanosis, or blue coloration, extending from the ears and spreading all over the face, until it is hard to distinguish the man's race. A few hours later, death comes, and it is simply a struggle for air until they suffocate. It is horrible. One can stand to see 1, 2, or 20 men die, but to see these poor devils dropping like flies gets on your nerves. We've been averaging 100 deaths a day and still keeping it up." This second wave of the flu, which had started sometime during the summer, was much more aggressive and fatal than the first wave. That first wave was relatively mild, but when the second wave erupted, people could hardly believe that it was the same disease. An alarmingly high proportion of patients died, 25 times as many as in previous flu pandemics. Though initially they reported the classic symptoms of flu, fever, sore throat, headache, soon they were turning blue in the face, having difficulty breathing, even bleeding from their noses and mouths. If blue turned to black, they were unlikely to recover. Their congested lungs were simply too full of fluid to process air, and death usually followed within hours or days. Colonel Victor Vaughan, an epidemiologist sent to Camp Devens by the Surgeon General, described the site of the infirmary as a picture painted on his memory cells. "I see hundreds of young, stalwart men in uniform coming into the wards of the hospital. Every bed is full, yet others crowd in. Their faces wear a bluish cast. A cough brings up the blood-stained sputum. In the morning, the bodies are stacked about the morgue like cordwood." The lungs are the lightest organ in the human body, as delicate as a butterfly wing. They never stop drawing in air and expelling breath. The lungs' 750 million air sacs, or alveoli, exchange the blood's gaseous wastes for fresh oxygen. An injury to their delicate tissues impedes critical renewal. With pneumonia, the elastic tissue of the lungs becomes coarse, riddled with hard nodules, but this usually takes some time. Not so with the Spanish flu. Autopsies of patients who died within 48 hours after onset of the disease revealed heavy, swollen, bloody lungs, which incredibly sank in water. The lungs were literally soaking in blood. A thin, frothy liquid oozed up from the throat, and blood gushed from the nose. Up until this time, the flu was actually thought of as a happy disease. You're out of commission for 4 or 5 days, and then you make a full, healthy recovery. But the Spanish flu was taking young, healthy people down. In a matter of a day or two, or even hours, the patient was dead, having drowned in their own lungs. 1/3 of the soldiers at Camp Devens became infected by the flu. Hundreds of doctors and nurses were brought in to care for the sick, but soon they too succumbed to the virus, and the care providers became patients too. As we have learned by now, the flu doesn't stay in one place for long. Just as with the Black Plague, boats and other methods of transport were bringing the disease by land or sea to new areas of opportunity. Sailors passing through the Commonwealth Pier in Boston brought the infection to New Orleans on a ship that was headed to Mexico. On September 7th, 300 sailors from Boston arrived at the Philadelphia Navy Yard, where they were reassigned to units across the country from Chicago to Seattle. 3,000 soldiers shipped out to Fort Hancock in Georgia. Their train arrived with 1/4 of the men aboard ill. 2/3 of the 3,000 would eventually be hospitalized, with at least 10% of them dying. Colonel Charles Hagedorn, commander of Camp Grant in Illinois, saw 5,000 of his soldiers take ill and 500 of them die from the Spanish flu. Taking personal responsibility for their deaths, the colonel took his own life. It is not too surprising that not long after the second wave of Spanish flu hit American civilians that rumors started circulating that the Germans were responsible. They had unleashed some kind of new germ warfare on the United States. One rumor had the German drug company Bayer inserting the germ into their aspirin. Ironically, the flu bug was actually moving in the opposite direction from the United States toward Europe. On the front, it affected both sides equally. The Germans, freed from their Russian front obligations, were preparing to launch massive assaults against the Allies on the Western Front. But the Spanish flu hit as many as 400,000 Germans within their trenches, and the major planned offenses had to be delayed. On September 29th, the massive transport ship, the Leviathan, left New York Harbor with 9,000 troops and 2,000 crew. The following morning, every bunk in the sick bay was taken, while other men lay prostrate in their berths. Within 3 days, 700 men were sick, and the ship suffered its first flu fatality. Running low on beds, healthy men were evicted from their bunks and sent to the lower, poorly ventilated decks of the ship. According to the official Navy report, pools of blood from severe nasal hemorrhages were scattered throughout the compartments, and the attendants were powerless to escape. They were left tracking through the mess because of the narrow passages between the bunks. The decks became slick with blood and other bodily fluids. The groans and cries of the terrified added to the confusion of the applicants clamoring for treatment. The ship arrived in Brest, France on October 8th, after 80 men had died on board. The sick were offloaded and sent for treatment to a nearby hospital. From there, the virus quickly spread from the American Expeditionary Force to the British Expeditionary Force to the French Army and across the German lines. According to Colonel Jefferson Keane, Deputy Chief Surgeon of the AEF, the disease's advance was frightening. On October 6th, he wrote, "Influenza and pneumonia have increased by the thousands of cases. The situation is very serious." 4 days later, he reported 1,451 deaths from the flu. The disease was killing at a rate of 1 out of every 2 infected. The AEF would lose 35,000 men between September and April 1919 to the flu, almost as many men as they would lose in that time fighting in the war. As in the United States, the summer of 1918 seemed to bring a reprieve from the flu to Great Britain. All records from the time show the first 9 months of the year as showing steady improvement from the Spanish flu virus. But in September, conditions just seemed ripe for a reprise. The month had opened so wet and cold and windy, ran one paper at the time, that anyone might well think we had reached the fringe of winter. By October, several rivers had spilled their banks, and low-lying fields were flooded, delaying harvests of food critically needed for the war effort. Advertisers of the time were already preparing for another bout of the Spanish lady. "Guard against the influenza," urged the Spectator. "Spray the atmosphere of the office, factory, home, and cinema. Disinfect all lavatories, sinks, and drains." In contrast, the editorial pages of the nation's major newspapers rarely mention the flu at all. The first report came on October 3rd in the Glasgow Herald from A.K. Chalmers, the medical officer of health in Glasgow. He announced that there had been 130 deaths from flu and pneumonia in the city. 2 weeks later, Chalmers reported that there were now 450 deaths attributable to flu and pneumonia. That represented 3.8% of the population, the highest rate since the 1889-92 flu pandemic. Catholic schools bolted their doors shut. Chalmers argued it made little sense to do so when so many other transmission sites, such as trams and railway cars, were still operating. Not all reports of pneumonia at the time were directly attributable to that ailment. Death from the flu tended to happen one of two ways. The victim drowned in his own fluids when his lungs became soaked with blood, or bacteria entered his severely damaged lungs and he died of pneumonia. That made collecting figures on the number of deaths problematic, since it was difficult to tell through the statistics when pneumonia was the primary cause or secondary cause of death. By mid-October, even the London papers could not avoid the truth. On October 22nd, the Daily Mirror declared that the flu was tightening its grip on the country, and doctors were in short supply as they were also succumbing to the bug. The virulent disease is seizing victims wholesale, the paper declared, and the doctors in London are unable to cope. People are well 1 hour and down the next. Doctors and clients' queues are the order of the day. Medical reports from that time claim that out of every 100 cases reporting cyanosis or blue skin coloration, 95 of those cases ended in death. Some victims, claim the report, big strong men, heliotrope blue and breathing 50 breaths to the minute, would be fully conscious and clear-headed up to within half an hour of death. Fire and police services, already thin from men called up for war, were spread thinner by the flu. In its second wave, the virus made rapid progress through the continent. In September, some 25,000 men in the French armed forces were laid low by the flu, and it was killing about 30 soldiers a day. During a period of 10 days in October, a further 36,000 became ill, and 2,400 died. Those who had previously been gassed by the Germans were the most likely to die, presumably from their weakened lungs and immune systems. That fall, 10,000 Parisians died from the flu. In Spain as well, the Spanish lady made a curtain call. In mid-September, Spanish newspapers were once again mentioning the flu. On September 17th, it was announced that the government was closing its border with France, effective the 20th, and on September 30th, it would close its border with Portugal to prevent the entry of the disease. That did little to help, as more than 1,100 people died of flu in Madrid during the autumn of 1918. In Russia, it is difficult to get accurate numbers. Following the armistice with Germany, thousands of Russian prisoners were released from German camps and sent by train back to Russia, bringing with them the influenza virus that had so devastated the German armed forces. Shortly after the armistice and the October Revolution that brought communism to Russia, the Russians found themselves in a full-scale civil war as the Whites, representing an anti-Bolshevik coalition, squared off against the Reds, representing the new Soviet government. Just as it had in the Western War, participants in this Eastern War were brought down by the thousands from the flu virus. Laura Spinney, in her book Pale Rider, stated that the death rate in Odessa was 1.2% of the population, which may even be a low rate given the conditions present. By September, 500 of 600 workers at a port in Sierra Leone were too sick to get out of bed. A transport ship from New Zealand, taking on coal from Sierra Leone's capital, Freetown, came down with 900 cases of influenza 3 weeks later. The virus seemed to be particularly lethal in areas of poverty and poor sanitation. In the Mexican state of Chiapas, 10% of the population died. Cape Town, South Africa lost 4% of its African population in just 4 weeks. Entire villages in Gambia were wiped out by influenza. Other nations were also dramatically affected. Buenos Aires in Argentina saw 55% of its population taken ill, while the attack rate in Brazil was 33%. Japan also saw 33% of its population come down with the flu. In Fiji, 14% of the population died in just 16 days. Western Samoa lost 22% of its population of 38,000, when a steamer brought the illness to that island nation. Spinney states that figures for China are almost impossible to determine as the Spanish flu arrived sandwiched between two visitations of pneumonic plague. One study extrapolated, based on the experience of similar countries, that China may have lost as many as 4 to 9.5 million people to the flu. But China's experience paled in comparison to that of India. India was hit harder than most major nations. Up to 10% of the population came down with the Spanish flu, as did 9% of European soldiers stationed there. Indian soldiers, perhaps because they were crammed into confined spaces in their camps, had a 21% mortality rate. In Bombay, 1,500 people died in just 1 week. Daily life activity practically ground to a halt in India during this time because 60% of the labor force was too sick to work. So many people were dying in the Punjab region, they ran out of wood for funeral pyres, a tradition of Hindu burials. It is estimated that about 20 million people died in India from the Spanish flu. If a similar death rate would have hit Europe the same way, the war would have ended months sooner due to a lack of participants. Iran, already suffering from famine and a cholera epidemic at the time, was hit with the Spanish flu in late 1918, which had possibly come from India, which shared a border at that time, or from Russian troops in Azerbaijan. Projected deaths for Iran from the Spanish flu range from 900,000 to 2.4 million, out of a population then at 10 million. Even the lower figure represents a 9% mortality rate. In the United States, many public officials treated the flu with denial. In Chicago, Boston, New Orleans, Santa Fe, Seattle, San Francisco, and Philadelphia, health officials claimed the flu was well under control much sooner than it actually was. And even children were making light of the virus. Schoolgirls in 1918 started singing a rhyme to keep time as they skipped rope. I had a little bird, and its name was Enza. I opened the window, and influenza. This actually turned into a dangerous stance. In late September, many of the cities who declared they had the flu under control held mammoth bond drives to support funding for the war effort. Chicago drew more than 150,000 people to their fundraiser, while Philadelphia drew over 200,000. Enormous crowds for that time. And with so many people packed so tightly together, it was the perfect environment for spreading the flu virus. The health commissioner in Detroit attempted to rule his city off limits to military personnel, who were the obvious source of the flu in the first weeks of September. He was immediately overruled by the Army, and Detroit joined the ranks of the sickened cities. All across the country, Army camps were filling up with the ill. 10,000 at Camp Grant, Illinois, 8,000 at Camp Dodge, Iowa, 11,000 at Camp Meade, Maryland, and 5,000 in Norfolk, Virginia. On September 22nd, Seattle, Washington hosted a parade of 10,000 National Guard infantry, and 3 days later the flu broke out in Seattle. When Vermont's 57th Pioneer Division set off on a march that would take them to the ship the Leviathan, a significant portion of the division dropped right in their tracks, too weak from flu to go on. Within 1 month of its arrival, the flu had killed more than 11,000 people in Philadelphia, one of the hardest hit cities in America. The Provost Marshal General was forced to cancel a draft call of 142,000 men. He had no choice. Too many of the Army camps were now under quarantine. Panicked flu victims and their worried relations looked for a cure. There was no vaccine available for this virus. After all, how can you cure something you can't even see? However, that didn't stop many charlatans from offering homemade vaccines and remedies. The first medicines doctors reached for were the wonder drugs of their times, aspirin and quinine. Aspirin, as we well know, is great for headaches, minor aches, and pains, while quinine worked wonders against malaria. But neither drug did a thing for Spanish influenza. These medications were often overprescribed, leading to a buzzing in the ear, vertigo, hearing loss, bloody urine, and vomiting. Next came the desperate remedies: digitalis, strychnine, arsenic, camphor oil, Epsom salts, and castor oil. These medications had worked for other ills, but were absolutely useless against the flu, and in some cases probably killed the patient faster than the flu would have. Some doctors advocated smoking cigarettes or consuming large quantities of alcohol, which at best, if done properly, could make a flu victim forget his symptoms. Next came the homemade tonics and elixirs. Gargling was a favored practice. But in the end, no vaccine, preventative, or curative was found. For all that modern medicine knew at that time, they did not know how to stop this flu. Into the fall, the flu progressed and became evident in cities in the U.S. and around the world. In Ottawa, Canada, the local newspaper reported that streetcars rattled down Bank Street with windows open and plenty of room inside. Schools, vaudeville theaters, and movie houses were dark. Pool halls and bowling alleys were deserted. In Cape Town, South Africa, they ran out of coffins, and bodies had to be buried in mass graves wrapped in blankets. Catherine Ann Porter, a well-known newspaper reporter in Denver, Colorado, contacted the flu and nearly died from it. Her fiancé, a lieutenant in the Army, did die from it. She wrote a story about her experiences in a novella titled Pale Horse, Pale Rider, in which she described her nightmare experience. All the theaters and nearly all of the restaurants and shops are closed, and the streets have been full of funerals all day and ambulances all night. In Washington, D.C., the epidemiologist Victor Vaughn was working long hours into the night collecting data from around the world. He saw a clear pattern. The virus was spreading rapidly around the world, infecting hundreds of millions and killing tens of millions. City dwellers seemed to have more immunity than country dwellers, perhaps because they had been exposed to more viruses in the densely packed cities. The virus was attacking the young and healthy, and not infants or the elderly. Perhaps the generation that had survived the Russian flu had built up a resistance. Sadly, no segment of the population was hit harder than pregnant women. Being with child may have made it more difficult to recover, or for their immune systems to fight back. Native Americans and other indigenous people who lived in isolated areas were particularly hard hit. Those populations, like people from rural areas, may have had the most susceptible immune systems due to the rarity of contacting prior viruses. Few communities were hit worse than the Unagan people in Bristol Bay, Alaska. Located on the Aleutian Island chain of Alaska that sweeps out to the easternmost tip of Russia, the communities in Bristol Bay were quite remote at that time. The Russians had settlements in Alaska in 1818, but the Americans purchased the territory from the Russians in 1867. However, by the time of the Spanish flu, many indigenous people were still Russian Orthodox in faith. The nearest Russian Orthodox priest, Father Dmitry Hodovitsky, a.k.a. Reverend Hot Whiskey, made the journey to Bristol Bay in April 1919 in order to lead Orthodox Easter services for that community. 3 weeks later, a very long period for incubation, the community came down with its first cases of Spanish flu. The one doctor and 2 nurses who were available to tend to the sick did what they could until the doctor and both the nurses eventually took ill. The community there lost 40% of its population, which created an entire generation of orphans. All of this happened during the 3rd wave of the epidemic. It should be noted that a quarantine imposed in the fall of 1918 was lifted in March 1919, 1 month prior to Father Hodovitsky's visit. One astounding feature of the Spanish flu was that of the 2 hardest hit communities, Bristol Bay and Western Samoa, one was located in the Arctic Circle and the other was located in the tropics of the South Pacific. Climate was no barrier to this virus. The second wave of the Spanish influenza virus was the most vicious. It spread faster, sickened people quicker, and killed at a rate higher than any pandemic seen since the Bubonic Plague. But as quickly as it raged upon the worldwide scene, it abruptly disappeared from many places. Philadelphia, the worst hit of American cities, which had witnessed 4,600 deaths by the end of October, reported that influenza had almost disappeared from the city by November. Other cities around the world were reporting the same thing. In Paris, where 50% of those infected by the flu died, and in Frankfurt, where 27% with the flu died, the influenza had all but disappeared before winter arrived. It was a worldwide phenomenon, with the exception of Australia, which had posted strict port quarantines during the second wave, then lifted the quarantines in November 1918. They suffered high mortality when the third wave struck in January and February, infecting as many as 2 million Australians and killing about 15,000. As the second wave of the virus was subsiding, and before the third wave began, the Great War ended, and an armistice was signed on November 11, 1918. Mark that in your calendars for next year. Mass celebrations broke out throughout the victorious countries. Soldiers and citizens celebrated with large gatherings, public parades, and spontaneous acts of affection between total strangers, namely kissing. It must have been a great day to be a microbe. In December, January, and February of 1919, the third wave, probably a mutated version of the second wave, was spreading across areas where people were just recovering from the effects of the flu devastation. In December, 2,100 residents of New York City died of the flu, and in January the number was even higher. San Francisco had adopted an aggressive stance toward hygiene with its public signs urging residents to obey the laws and wear the gauze, protect yourself from septic paws. That city reported only 50 new cases of flu in the first week of December, and it had opted to unmask in November 21st after a public proclamation. By January, reports of flu were skyrocketing again. In the third week of January, the city reported 3,500 new cases of flu and 310 deaths. That winter, some U.S. cities made it a crime to leave a quarantined home and an offense to sneeze in public. In the UK, demobilized soldiers were returning home, with 600,000 coming back from France by late January and 100,000 a week in February. By mid-February, London was reporting an influenza death rate of 653 a week. A brutally cold winter had contributed to rebounding rates of infection and deaths in Liverpool, Newcastle, Bradford, and Manchester. After a lull in November, Paris saw 1,400 people die of flu in December and 1,500 die in January. By May of 1919, the Spanish influenza was subsiding and disappearing from most parts of the world, with Peru and Japan being the main exceptions. There, the Spanish flu did not run its course until 1920. One very notable victim of the third wave of the Spanish flu was U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. On December 4, 1918, Wilson left New York City for Brest, France, on his way to the capital for the Paris peace talks. Unlike his French and British counterparts, Wilson was pursuing a just and equitable peace with defeated Germany, highlighted by his 14 points, which sought to expand democratic freedoms and discourage future wars. Wilson was clear on what he wanted from negotiations: peace without victory. On April 3rd, the president woke up fit as a fiddle. By sunset, he was seized with violent paroxysms of coughing, which were so severe and frequent that it interfered with his breathing. Wilson would spend most of the peace talks bedridden. When he returned to the conference table, he was a changed man. Gone was his ardent defense of a just peace and a cooperative Europe. Instead, he had backed down to every demand made by Georges Clemenceau, the French premier. Germany would face tremendous war reparations and losses of huge tracts of territory. In disgust, Wilson said of the agreement, "If I were a German, I think I should never sign it." Germany did sign it, and Wilson's change of heart is often cited as one of the contributory causes for the Second World War. The final fatality figures for the Spanish flu are hard to determine. In some of the hardest-hit countries like China, India, Iran, and parts of Africa, accurate medical records weren't kept. 10 years after the flu faded away, a number of 20 million had been concluded. But more recently, with more research on the subject, The final numbers usually agreed upon are between 50 and 100 million. The lower figure represents more people killed by flu than by all the causes from the Great War. The higher figure represents a much higher total than for all civilian and military deaths during World War II. It would also make the Spanish flu the most fatal catastrophe in all human history, representing about 5% of the world population at the time, and it infected nearly 1 out of every 3 people. How is it that we know so little about what was possibly mankind's worst moment? For more than 50 years, there was little written about the Spanish flu. Even the doctors and researchers who were studying and treating the flu at the time left hardly any written record. In 1976, a history professor at Washington State University by the name of Alfred Crosby was gazing at a wall full of almanacs. On a whim, he picked up the almanac for 1917 and learned that the average life expectancy in the U.S. for that year was 51 years. He then selected the almanac for 1919. Again, the average life expectancy was 51 years. He took a look at the 1918 almanac. That year, the average life expectancy was 39 years. What had happened? How was it that life expectancy managed to drop 12 years in 1918 and then suddenly return to normal? He then realized it had to have been the influenza epidemic. His own father had lived through it but never talked about it. Crosby would eventually write a book on that subject called Epidemic in Peace, and his work would get other researchers interested in the subject. The Spanish flu took 675,000 American lives. That's more lives than were taken in the Civil War. In fact, that is more lives taken than all of the other American wars combined. In the UK, the number was 228,000. South Africa, with a much smaller total population, lost 140,000 people. So why is it rarely covered in history books, or when it is, never to any depth? One possible reason may be the timing. The Spanish flu struck right in the concluding years of World War I. For most of the Allied nations of Europe, they had already suffered a great deal, going back to the beginning of the war. Britain was under constant attack from German Zeppelins. For France, most of the war was fought in her front yard, and fear of being overrun was constant. For all participants, the slaughter was on a scale never witnessed before. The flu must have just seemed like one more irritant to endure before peace returned again. The Spanish flu also happened in a relatively short period of time, 1 year in most places, but generally most of the damage occurred in just one 3-month window in the fall of 1918. It also came in 3 waves. Even though the duration was short, to people at that time it must have felt like it would never go away. Coming as it did during the war, no soldier's family wanted to be told that their son died from a flu virus before his ship ever made it to France. Instead, they were told that their son died in the field of battle. The great influenza had a stigma attached to it. It was not just an unheroic way to die. It was a very messy and, let's just say it, a grotesque way to die. The virus ate people from the inside out. The victim's life often ended with him or her with a deathly pale blue face, coughing up blood and pieces of lungs. In many places, death hit so hard and so fast the bodies had to be piled up one on top of the other, like so much cordwood, as one observer described. It was also a faceless enemy. Whereas the Germans were a people, and Kaiser Wilhelm was a defined character whose portrait was well known at that time, microorganisms are invisible to the eye, yet were everywhere, all around. Finally, people had entered the war with a tremendous faith in technology and progress, particularly in the fields of science and medicine. The Great War, with its terrifying machinery and killing fields, along with the relentless onslaught of the flu virus, which defeated every scientific attempt to control it, was a tremendous blow to people's confidence in the modern world and its ability to make life better. For everyone who survived the flu, the best idea just seemed to be move on. So who was our patient zero? Who was that one person that first contacted the H1N1 virus from an animal and then from there to the rest of the human race? We will never know for certain. That kind of infectious disease detective work is extremely hard to do 100 years after the fact. However, through a lot of research, including written accounts, reports, and preserved tissue samples, most modern researchers have ruled out China and France as the likely sources of origin. In the case of Etapla, records indicate that the flu did not spread out rapidly from that source as it had in so many other places. That version of the flu was not as aggressive or as quick to take hold as the Spanish flu. As for China, all flu outbreaks prior to March 1918 were studied, and none of them had the characteristics of the Spanish flu. And it would have been difficult for the virus to travel all the way to Fort Riley, which is landlocked, and thus it would have taken weeks, if not months, for an infected victim to make it there from China, giving the virus little chance to survive. That leaves Kansas as the best source, and Haskell County in particular. Dr. Lori Miner, the Haskell County doctor who tracked the flu patients there in February, did manage to get a short article published in the Public Health Reports Journal prior to the major outbreak at Camp Funston. Haskell was one of the poorest counties in Kansas. There were many hog farmers and waterfowl and a large number of homes built out of sod. With Haskell being a major stopping-off point before Fort Riley, it would have presented a perfect route for the virus, from Haskell to Camp Funston to the East Coast Army camps and Navy yards to Brest, France, and then on to the world. There is no unanimous opinion on the actual source of the flu, but for a considerable number of experts, Haskell County is the spot. Thank you for joining me for the Podcast of Doom. Please feel free to comment regarding your thoughts by emailing me at podcastofdoom@aol.com or visit me at www.thepodcastofdoom.com. I apologize if I haven't been able to return your comments and emails right away. You would not believe how much time I put into researching each episode. You can support the show by letting your friends and family know about it and by leaving comments wherever you are downloading the show, whether that is iTunes or somewhere else. Also, I know my episodes are now running an hour or longer. Let me know if this is too long or if I should just keep going with these long shows. I really hate to break a topic up into multiple episodes unless I have to. Next time we will examine Air France Flight 4590. Flight 4590 was a Concorde-type supersonic jet. On July 25, 2000, the jet was taking off from Gonesse, France, when it hit some debris on the runway, which damaged one of its tires, and a piece of one of those tires punctured the fuel tank. I will keep you guessing as to what happened next, but you have my assurances that it doesn't end well. Until next time, keep your ears pinned and your tail taut.